You see, something's going to happen.
What? What's going to happen?
Something wonderful.
What?
I understand how you feel. You see, it's all very clear to me now.
There are names in history that don't just belong to the past. They feel like forces. Not because they were perfect, not because they were always right, but because once their ideas enter the world could never quite go back to what it was before. Plato is one of those names. When people talk about Western thought, philosophy, metaphysics, the soul, the nature of reality, or even the way our society imagines truth and illusion, they are often walking through the rooms Plato helped build. Whether we realize it or not, we still live inside questions he made impossible to ignore. What is real? What is merely appearance? What makes a life worth living? What is justice? What is the soul? And above all, how does a human being climb out of ignorance and into something like clarity? That's why this isn't just going to be one episode. This is a multi-part series because Plato isn't a topic you cover. Plato is a labyrinth, and once you step inside, you start seeing echoes of his thought everywhere, in politics and religion, in mysticism and psychology, in education, in empire, in art, in the way modern people argue online about truth as if they're chained in a cave watching shadows and calling it reality. Plato isn't just a philosopher. He's a map of how civilizations dream, rationalize, justify, and mythologize their world. So here's how we're doing it. In part one, we're going to start where every real understanding begins, with the human being. Not Plato the statue, not Plato the textbook, Plato the man, born into the chaos of Athens, shaped by war and political collapse, and haunted by one event that marks his history like a scar, the trial and execution of Socrates. We'll explore the world that produced him, the culture of the polis, the spiritual and mythic atmosphere of Greek religion, the intellectual background of sophists and statesmen, and the personal shock that turned a young aristocrat into a lifelong architect of ideas. The first part is about the origin story, because you can't understand Plato's obsession with justice, truth, and the soul unless you understand the world that convinced him that society was sick and that most people mistake confidence for wisdom. Then in part two, we descend into Plato's major works, his dialogues, because Plato doesn't lecture you. He traps you in conversations. He stages philosophy like a drama, and inside those dialogues are some of the most influential concepts ever written. The theory of forms, the tripartite soul, the education of the philosopher, the nature of love as spiritual ascent, and yes, the allegory of the cave, one of the most haunting metaphors ever produced for the human condition. Part two is where we go deeper. We're not just summarizing what he said. We're going to unpack what he meant, why it mattered, how the ideas connect, and why they still shape the way modern people talk about knowledge, reality, morality, and even enlightenment. And finally, in part three, me and the crew are coming on together for a full discussion episode, the Roundtable. Because Plato is the kind of thinker you don't just read. You argue with him. You test him. You bring his ideas into the modern world and see what survives the collision. That's where we'll take everything from parts one and part two and put it on the table. The cave, the forms, the philosopher king, the soul, love, myth, reason, power, and whether Plato was building a ladder to truth or designing a beautiful prison with a perfect blueprint. And here's the real reason we're doing it as a crew discussion. Plato's dialogues were never meant to be passive. They're meant to be alive. They're meant to provoke. Plato wrote conversations so that the reader becomes the missing speaker, the one who has to decide what's true, what's dangerous, and what's still worth keeping. So welcome to the series. This is Plato, not as a dry chapter in a textbook, but as a living force that still shadows the modern mind. A philosopher whose questions can feel like a lantern or an interrogation light. A man who asked what reality is and then dared to suggest that most of us have never actually seen it. And if Plato is right, if the world is a cave, then the only question that matters is who's brave enough to walk out. Plato arrived in the world just as classical Athens was passing from the brilliance of Periclean grandeur into the long shadow of the Peloponnesian War. Born into an old aristocratic family, the boy grew up amid political upheaval, public debate, and a culture still flush with dramatic poetry and astonishing aristocratic innovation. Born into an old aristocratic family, the boy grew up amid political upheaval, public debate, and a culture still flush with dramatic poetry and astonishing artistic innovation. This was the city of Sophocles and Aristophanes, of the sophist who sold wisdom for a fee, and of Socrates who gave it away at the price of relentless self-examination. In that charged atmosphere, Plato first learned that ideas could rouse armies, topple governments, and remake individual lives. As a young man, he encountered Socrates and quickly exchanged his family's traditional path of statesmanship for the more radical vocation of philosophy. The 8 years he spent at his teacher's side and the anguish of watching that teacher condemned and executed by a democratic jury etched into him the conviction that only genuine knowledge could ground a just life or a just state. Determined to discover what such knowledge might be, Plato left Athens on a decade-long quest that took him to Megara, southern Italy, and Sicily, where he studied mathematics with Pythagoreans, debated tyrants, and very nearly died in slavery. Returning home, he founded his own school in a sacred olive grove outside the city walls, the Academy, a community devoted to geometry, astronomy, music, and above all, dialectic. From that sanctuary flowed the dialogues, dramatic conversations in which the historical figures of Socrates becomes a mouthpiece for some of the boldest ideas ever proposed. From that sanctuary flowed the dialogues, dramatic conversations in which the historical figure of Socrates becomes a mouthpiece for some of the boldest ideas ever proposed. The theory of forms, the immortality of the soul, the tripartite psyche, the philosopher king, and the demand that reason govern both city and self. Together, those writings form the first great library of Western philosophy, a unified but never dogmatic exploration of ethics, epistemology, mathematics, art, and love. They begin with the apologia of a man unjustly killed, and they culminate in a sprawling blueprint for a society ruled by wisdom. That arc, from courtroom tragedy to utopian imagination, frames the life of a thinker who set the horizon for every serious conversation about truth that has followed. Wherever a man has taken a position, he must remain and face the danger, without a thought for death or anything else. Plato, who was born between 428 and 427 BCE and died between 348 and 347 BCE, was an ancient Athenian philosopher whose influence on Western thought is immeasurable. A student of Socrates and the teacher of Aristotle, he authored dozens of philosophical dialogues that have shaped ethics, metaphysics, politics, and education for over 2 millennia. He also founded the Academy in Athens, often regarded as the first university in the Western world. Through his writings, Plato introduced enduring ideas such as the theory of forms, the immortality of the soul, and the ideal of a philosopher king that became cornerstones of Western philosophy. This episode presents Plato's life. It explores the historical context of his times, surveys his major works and ideas, and examines his lasting legacy, from antiquity through the medieval and Renaissance periods and beyond. Plato was born in Athens in the closing years of the city's golden age, just as the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta was beginning to ravage the Greek world. Ancient sources vary on his birth year, but is traditionally given as 428 or 427 BCE, about a year after the death of the great statesman Pericles. He was born into an aristocratic and politically active family. His father Ariston of Dame Colitis claimed lineage from the early kings of Athens, legends tracing back to the god Poseidon. Plato's mother, Perictione, was related to the famous lawgiver Solon and came from a distinguished Athenian family. Through his mother, Plato was also a nephew of Charmides and a cousin of Critias. This noble heritage meant Plato grew up in an environment deeply connected to Athens' social and political elite. Plato's birth name was reportedly Aristocles after his grandfather, but he was given the nickname Platon, meaning broad, either due to his broad physique or broad forehead, by his wrestling coach. He had 2 older brothers, Glaucon and Adimantus, and his sister Poton. These brothers famously appeared as characters in Plato's own dialogue Republic. When Plato was still a boy, his father Ariston died, and his mother remarried her own uncle Pyrolamps, an associate of Pericles. Through that marriage, Plato gained a half-brother, Antiphon. Raised in this well-to-do household, young Plato would have received the typical education of an Athenian gentleman: instruction in grammar, poetry, music, and gymnastics. There are reports that in his youth, Plato wrote poetry and even staged plays. An anecdote, likely apocryphal, claims that he had burned his early tragic poems after he fell in love with philosophy under Socrates' spell. Athens, during Plato's childhood, was a city at war and in cultural bloom at once. The Peloponnesian War, from 431 to 404 BCE, brought hardships, plague, military expeditions, and eventual defeat of Athens by Sparta in 404 BCE, all events that would shape the outlook of Plato's generation. Despite wartime turbulence, Athens remained a vibrant center of learning and art. Sophocles and Euripides were producing tragedies, Aristophanes satirized society in comedies, and the sophists were traveling teachers who sparked intellectual debates about virtue and truth. It was in this milieu that Plato came of age. He who would precede all right should begin from the beauties of earth, until he grasps that wondrous vision, beauty absolute, simple, and everlasting. As a young man, Plato became part of the circle of Socrates, the charismatic philosopher who roamed Athens challenging people to examine their lives. Plato likely encountered Socrates in his late teens or early 20s, around 409 to 406 BCE, and was profoundly impressed. According to an ancient story, Plato had been preparing to compete as a playwright, but upon hearing Socrates' discourse in the marketplace, he abandoned literature for philosophy, supposedly remarking, "Come here, Vulcan, for Plato needs your aid," as he consigned his poems to the flames. Whether literally true or not, this tale illustrates Socrates' powerful influence on the youth. For about 8 years, Plato was a devoted pupil of Socrates, absorbing methods of relentless questioning now known as the Socratic method. Socrates taught not by writing treatises, but by engaging in dialogue, questioning assumptions about piety, justice, courage, and virtue among his fellow citizens. Plato witnessed firsthand Socrates' mission to spur critical self-examination. Socrates' method and moral conviction left an indelible mark on Plato. He later cast Socrates as the principal speaker in almost all his dialogues, using Socratic conversation as the vehicle for his own ideas. Athens underwent political turmoil during this period. In 404 BCE, Plato's relatives, Critias and Charmides, were key figures in the oligarchic 30 tyrants who seized power with Spartan support after Athens' defeat. Plato was reportedly invited to join their regime, but he grew disillusioned as the oligarchs became oppressive. The tyranny fell in 403 BCE, and democracy was restored. Soon after, in 399 BCE, the democratic government executed Socrates on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. Plato was about 28 and was present at the trial. He later recounted Socrates' apology, defense speech, in one of his earliest writings. The unjust condemnation of his beloved teacher profoundly affected Plato. In a letter traditionally attributed to him, Plato wrote that witnessing Socrates' fate made him wary of entering public life. Indeed, he turned away from any political career, convinced that neither the oligarchy nor the radical democracy had delivered wise or just leadership. In the Apology dialogue, Plato memorializes Socrates' courage and ideals. Socrates, at his trial, insists that he will not give up on philosophizing, famously asserting that the unexamined life is not worth living. Plato's account of Socrates' final days, including the Credo, where Socrates refuses to escape prison, upholding his ethical duty to the laws of Athens, and the Phaedo, which movingly describes Socrates discussing the immortality of the soul before calmly drinking the hemlock poison. Plato kept Socratic thought alive even after his mentor's death. After Socrates' execution, Plato left Athens, a common act of piety for a disciple mourning his master. Sources indicate he first joined other Socratic adherents in Megara, a nearby city under philosopher Euclid of Megara. In subsequent years, 399 to 387 BCE, Plato likely traveled throughout the Mediterranean world. While details are sparse and sometimes conjectural, later reports and clues from his letters suggest a period of wide-range traveling. Egypt. Plato possibly visited Egypt, the ancient land of wisdom. The geographer Strabo claimed that in Heliopolis he was shown the house where Plato stayed. In dialogues like Phaedrus, Plato refers to Egyptian lore, the myth of the invention of writing, and in the Timaeus he hints at Egyptian priests recounting the story of Atlantis, suggesting at least a fascination with Egypt. Whether or not he went there, Egyptian civilization's antiquity may have influenced his thinking about timeless wisdom and ideal societies. Some accounts have Plato studying mathematics in Cyrene with the renowned mathematician Theodorus. Theodorus actually appears as a character in Plato's later dialogue Theaetetus. This indicates Plato had connections with leading mathematicians of his day, reinforcing his deep interest in mathematics. Plato certainly traveled to Greek colonies in southern Italy, where he encountered the followers of Pythagoras. Pythagorean philosophy, with its emphasis on number, harmony, and the transmigration of souls, made a lasting imprint on Plato's thought. Diogenes reports that Plato visited several Pythagoreans in southern Italy, and his own seventh letter mentions a friendship with Archytas of Tarentum, a statesman and Pythagorean thinker. Plato's reverence for mathematics and his notion that abstract forms underlie reality owe much to Pythagorean ideas. In fact, later tradition held that a sign at the door of Plato's academy read, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here," highlighting the Pythagorean Platonic belief in mathematics as a gateway to higher knowledge. The most momentous journeys Plato took were to the island of Sicily, where he became entangled in the politics and the city of Syracuse. Plato first went to Sicily around 388 BCE when he was about 40. There he met Dionysius, the autocratic tyrant of Syracuse, and more faithfully, Dionysius' brother-in-law Dion, a young man who became Plato's ardent student. There he met Dionysius, the autocratic tyrant of Syracuse, and more faithfully, Dionysius' brother-in-law Dion, a young man who became Plato's ardent student and friend. Plato's teachings fascinated Dion. It appears Plato harbored the ambitious hope of educating a ruler in philosophy, to realize, in practice, the vision of a philosopher king that he would later describe in his Republic. The Sicilian sojourn, however, ended poorly. Later legends, reported by Plutarch and Diogenes, claimed that Plato offended the tyrant Dionysius by his frank speech and was sent into bondage. Allegedly, Dionysius sold Plato into slavery, or at least had taken him to the slave market of Aegina, then at war with Athens. In one count, Plato was nearly put to death in captivity at Cyrene, but was saved when a sympathetic admirer, Anacyrus of Cyrene, purchased his freedom and sent him home to Athens. While some details are doubtful, it's clear Plato's first Sicilian adventure was a harrowing lesson in the clash between idealism and tyranny. He left Syracuse disappointed, though having forged a deep bond with Dion. Plato returned to Athens by 387 BCE. Around this time, he founded the Academy, a school of higher learning that he would direct for the next 4 decades. The Academy was situated in a grove of olive trees just outside Athens' walls, a site sacred to the hero Academus, hence the name. It wasn't a formal university as we think of today, but it functioned as a gathering place for inquiry where philosophy, science, and mathematics were pursued in a community of teachers and students. The Academy is often cited as the first enduring institution devoted to research and philosophy, the ancestor of later universities. Within its precincts, Plato lectured and engaged in dialogue with brilliant minds of the era. Eminent mathematicians like Theaetetus, discoverer of geometric truths, and Exodus of Cnidus, an astronomer who developed theories of proportion, were associated with the Academy. Perhaps Plato's greatest pupil, Aristotle, entered the Academy as a teenager in 367 BCE and studied under Plato for 20 years. The Academy emphasized a broad curriculum. Students learned mathematics, geometry and arithmetic, astronomy, music theory, and dialectical philosophy, reflecting Plato's conviction that rigorous training in science and math prepares the mind for higher philosophical insight. Plato himself was not a prolific research mathematician, but he absorbed and integrated the discoveries of others. His dialogues are prepared with mathematical examples and metaphors, and in Timaeus, he even presents a cosmology built on geometry, notably describing the 5 regular solids that are now known as the Platonic solids and associating them with fundamental elements of the universe. Except for 2 further Sicilian expeditions, Plato remained based at the Academy for the rest of his life, writing and teaching. The Academy thrived and endured long after Plato's death. In fact, Speusippus, Plato's nephew, succeeded him as Scholarch, head of the Academy, followed by Xenocrates and others, and the school continued, with interruptions, until 529 CE, when the Byzantine Emperor Justinian closed the pagan philosophical schools. For almost 900 years, Plato's Academy stood as a beacon of learned culture in the Greco-Roman world, a testament to the powerful institution, invention of communal scholarly pursuit that Plato had set in motion. The soul is most like that which is divine, immortal, intelligible, uniform, indissoluble, ever the same as itself. Plato's philosophical convictions about politics, that rulers should be philosophers, were dramatically tested in his interactions with the rulers of Syracuse. After the death of Dionysus in 367 BCE, Dion urged Plato to make his second journey to Syracuse. The idea was to educate the new young tyrant Dionysus II in philosophy, hopefully turning him into the just ruler that Syracuse and perhaps the world needed. Though Plato was now in his 60s and initially skeptical that a true philosopher king could be made out of Dionysus II, he eventually agreed to attempt this bold experiment. In 367 or 366 BCE, he traveled again to Sicily. Unfortunately, the project unraveled. Dionysus II was intellectually fickle and politically insecure. Within a short time, the tyrant grew suspicious of Dion, his uncle and Plato's ally. Dion was exiled, accused of treason, and Plato himself was effectively detained, treated outwardly with honor as a guest, but in reality not allowed to leave the island. Plato had walked into a political snake pit. He was without his friend Dion, trying to counsel on an autocrat who only partially trusted him. After some tense months, Plato convinced Dionysus II to let him return home, promising that he would come back once the war was over. Plato returned to Athens, with Dion joining him at the academy for a time. A few years later, Dionysus II called for Plato yet again. Despite misgivings and his advancing age, Plato a third time sailed to Syracuse around 361 BCE, hoping to reconcile Dion and Dionysus and achieve some philosophical influence on the regime. This final Sicilian venture proved the worst. Dionysus II not only refused to restore Dion to favor, but once more placed Plato under quasi-house arrest in Syracuse. Plato was isolated and unable to effect meaningful change at court. He escaped only thanks to the intercession of the Pythagorean friends from Italy, including Archytas of Tarentum, who negotiated his release. Freed from Syracuse at last, Plato returned to Athens, shaken and resolved to stay out of Syracusan politics for good. Subsequently, Dion gathered mercenaries, and in 357 BCE he did overthrow Dionysus II by force, an action Plato did not endorse. Dion ruled Syracuse briefly but was assassinated in 354 BCE, plunging the city into further chaos. These episodes affirmed to Plato how intractable real-world politics could be, and how difficult it was to enact philosophical ideals amid greed and power struggles. In his seventh letter, if it is indeed by Plato, as many scholars believe, Plato reflects on these events, expressing bitter disappointment at Dionysus II's character and acknowledging that his hopes of a philosopher king went unrealized. By 360 BCE, Plato was back at the academy, and there he remained, presumably pouring his experience and lessons into his writings. One lasting result of the Sicilian adventures was a deepening of Plato's pessimism about unphilosophical politicians, a theme evident in later dialogues like Statesmen and Laws, where he grapples with the gulf between ideal theories and the practical governance of flawed humans. Plato's fames rest on his dialogues, vivid literary conversations, mostly featuring Socrates as a protagonist, through which Plato examined a vast range of philosophical questions. At least 25 dialogues and a dozen more of disputed authenticity have come down to us. They are typically divided by scholars into three chronological groups: early, middle, and late dialogues, which reflect shifts in Plato's style and philosophical focus. The exact order of composition is not certain, but a rough progression can be discerned. Early dialogues. In these, Plato attempts to capture the spirit of the historical Socrates. They are set during Socrates' lifetime and focus on ethical questions, often ending without a clear resolution. Socrates here mostly asks probing questions, but proposes few doctrines of his own. Examples: Apology, Socrates' trial defense; Euthyphro, on piety; Crito, on justice and obedience to law; Charmides, on temperance; Laches, on courage; Protagoras, on whether virtue can be taught; Gorgias, a critique of rhetorical persuasion and a debate on justice; and Ion, on poetic inspiration. In these texts, Socrates is portrayed as a staunch moral intellectualist, believing that virtue is knowledge and that nobody does wrong willingly, but only out of ignorance. The early dialogues lay the groundwork for Plato's later theories by examining moral concepts and exposing the inadequacies of conventional notions of goodness. Then we have the middle dialogues. Plato's own philosophical voice emerges more boldly here, even as Socrates remains the lead character. These dialogues introduce Plato's most famous doctrines, notably the theory of forms, and often present positive philosophical theories rather than simply questioning others. The middle period works are also literary masterpieces with dramatic depth. Key examples: Meno, Phaedo, Symposium, Republic, and Phaedrus. In the Meno, Socrates and a young interlocutor explore whether virtue can be taught, leading to the paradox of inquiry and the idea that learning is recollection of knowledge the soul knew before birth, introducing Plato's doctrine of anamnesis, the soul's preexistence. The Phaedo contains Plato's first full argument for the immortality of the soul, asserting that the soul, being akin to the eternal and unchanging forms, lives on after the body's death. In Symposium, a series of speeches by Socrates and others unfold the concept of eros, love, culminating in Socrates relaying the teachings of Diotima, who describes a ladder of love rising from physical attraction to love of beauty and ultimately love of the eternal form of beauty itself. Symposium thereby develops the notion of Platonic love, a love that ascends to the appreciation of pure form. The Republic, Plato's best-known work, is a sprawling dialogue about justice in the individual and the ideal state. It introduces the allegory of a cave, wherein most people live chained in a world of shadows, illusion, unless freed to see the light of truth. Central to the Republic is the theory of forms, the idea that for every concept or quality, justice, beauty, equality, etc., there is a perfect, unchanging archetype, a form, which is the most real and true instantiation of that quality. The form of good is highest of all, illuminating the knowability of other forms, as the sun in the allegory illuminates the visible world. The Republic also lays out Plato's vision of a just society ruled by philosopher kings, those who have ascended to knowledge of the good. In Phaedrus, Plato combined two topics, love and rhetoric. It features the famous chariot allegory of the soul, depicting the soul as a charioteer with two winged horses, one noble and one unruly, symbolizing the conflict between rational and irrational impulses in the soul. Phaedrus also critiques writing and rhetoric, suggesting that the true art of persuasion must be based on truth and an understanding of the soul. Across these middle works, Plato's philosophical positions crystallize. The soul is immortal and divided into parts: reason, spirit, appetite. Knowledge is justified true belief rooted ultimately in recollection of the forms. Virtue is a kind of harmony of the soul's parts under reason's guidance, and the highest aim is to contemplate the eternal realities, forms, beyond the shifting world of senses. In the late dialogues, these works, likely written in Plato's later years, around 360 to 347 BCE, are often more challenging and subtle. Socrates either plays a smaller role or is absent entirely, and Plato engages in meticulous philosophical analysis, sometimes even reconsidering or critiquing his earlier ideas. In Theaetetus, an older Socrates and the young mathematician Theaetetus attempt to define knowledge, examining and rejecting definitions like knowledge is perception, and ending inconclusively after deep puzzling over how we can know anything for certain. The Parmenides dialogue is especially striking. It depicts the philosopher Parmenides rigorously criticizing the theory of forms that young Socrates proposes, pointing out puzzles and contradictions, such as the famous third-man argument problem of infinite regress when considering the form of largeness. Many interpret this as Plato's own critical self-examination of the forms doctrine. In Sophist and the Statesman, a character known as Eleatic Stranger, not Socrates, leads the discussion. Sophist tackles the nature of non-being and being, developing a sophisticated analysis of how false statements are possible, thereby addressing Parmenides' challenge that one cannot speak of what is not. It refines Plato's metaphysics by introducing distinctions between kinds and suggests that the forms themselves interrelate. The Statesman tries to pin down the definition of a true statesman, or king, through a tedious but illuminating process of division, and offers myths like the story of cosmic reversals of time. The dialogue implicitly critiques earlier political idealism, acknowledging that the pure philosophical king ideal of the Republic might be unattainable and that the statesman must often work with imperfect laws. Philebus discusses what constitutes the highest good for humans, weighing pleasure versus intellect, and concludes that a life mixed of wisdom and measured enjoyment is superior to a life of pure pleasure. Timaeus is Plato's grand cosmological treatise. In it, a single speaker, Timaeus, delivers a speculative account of the origin of the universe. Plato posits a divine craftsman, the demiurge, who imposes mathematical order on chaos, using the eternal forms as a model. Timaeus describes the creation of the world's soul, the composition of the four elements from geometric solids, and the origin of human souls and bodies, an ambitious synthesis of metaphysics, science, and theology. It was one of Plato's most influential works in later antiquity and the Middle Ages, particularly because it was one of the few dialogues available in Latin. Critias, intended as a sequel to Timaeus, recounts the tale of Atlantis, a mighty ancient empire that fought and lost against primordial Athens before perishing in a cataclysm. This story is likely a brilliant fiction or allegory created by Plato, perhaps meant to illustrate the hubris of nations. Unfortunately, Critias isn't incomplete. It breaks off mid-sentence, leaving the Atlantis story tantalizingly unfinished. Plato's final work, Laws, is unique in that Socrates is absent. Instead, an anonymous Athenian stranger guides the discussion. Laws spans 12 books of conversation about designing a city governed by detailed laws and a mixed government. It's more sober and pragmatic than the Republic, often considered a second best politely where no philosopher king is assumed. In the Laws, Plato advocates for the rule of law above all, incorporating strict regulations on education, drinking, and even music, and introducing the concept of nocturnal council, a sort of philosophical overseers of the laws. By writing dialogues rather than essays, Plato allows multiple perspectives to be heard and encourages the reader to engage actively with the arguments. This indirect style means Plato doesn't speak in his own voice, making it occasionally challenging to discern his definite stance. As one scholar noted, few of Plato's writings can be seen as mere advocacy or simple doctrines. They often present puzzles and leave matters open for interpretation. For instance, he extols the forms in many dialogues, but also raises difficulties about them in Parmenides. He praises the contemplative life, yet in Laws he focuses on mundane legal codes. This dynamic quality is why the Platonic corpus has generated diverse interpretations over the centuries. Behold, human beings living in an underground den. Education is the art of turning the whole soul toward the light. At the heart of Plato's philosophy is the theory of forms, or ideas. Simply put, Plato maintained that beyond the imperfect physical world that we perceive with our senses, there exists a higher reality of eternal, unchanging, perfect forms. The things we see and touch, trees, chairs, acts of justice, beautiful objects, or merely imperfect copies or participations of their ideal form of tree, form of chair, justice itself, beauty itself. The forms are invisible and intelligible, grasped by the mind rather than the senses. They are the true realities that give shape and meaning to the observable world. Plato's forms are his answer to a fundamental philosophical question. How can we have stable, certain knowledge in a world that is always changing? He was influenced here by pre-Socratic philosophers. Heraclitus had said all is flux, so how can anything be known or defined? Whereas Parmenides insisted that reality is unitary and changeless. Plato's forms reconcile this by positing the two levels of reality. The changing sensory world, where nothing perfectly is, it's always becoming something else, and the timeless world of forms, where true being resides. For example, many particular things are called beautiful, but they're all imperfect and transient. Yet we have a notion of beauty itself that is perfect and never changes. That beauty itself is the form of beauty, which particular beautiful things partake in. In the Republic, Plato illustrates this with the divine line analogy in the allegory of the cave. Most people live among shadows, mistakenly sensory appearances of reality, like prisoners in a cave seeing only shadows on a wall. The philosopher, in contrast, breaks free to glimpse the sunlight of truth, the forms, and especially the highest form, the form of the good, which is the source of all reality and knowledge, analogous to the sun illuminating the visible world. The form of good gives being and intelligibility to all other forms, justice, beauty, and so on, yet itself beyond being in dignity. Plato admitted that the good is hard to know. He portrayed it as a mystery only apprehended at the climax of philosophical education. Plato's metaphysics thus elevates abstract universals to the most real status, whereas concrete particulars are lower copies. This was a radical idea with enormous influence on later philosophy and theology. It introduced a two-tiered view of reality, an intelligible realm of permanence versus sensible realm of change, which became a hallmark of Platonism. It also had ethical implications. To Plato, only knowledge of the eternal forms, especially the good, can guide the soul to true virtue and fulfillment. The material world and bodily pleasures, being ever in flux and imperfect, can distract us from the pursuit of the eternal truths. Plato's concept of soul, psyche, is deeply intertwined with his metaphysics. He regarded the soul as immortal and divine, more akin to the eternal forms than to the perishable body. In dialogues like Phaedo, Republic, and Phaedrus, Plato offers various arguments for the soul's immortality and portrays the soul's journey beyond this life. One argument in Phaedo is that life comes from death and death from life in an eternal cycle, implying the soul must exist before birth to be reborn. Another is that the soul grasps the forms, like absolute equality, which are eternal, so the soul itself must be of similar nature, invisible, indivisible, and everlasting. Plato's psychology divides the human soul into three parts, as described in Republic Book 4 and refined in Phaedrus: reason, spirit or will, emotion, and appetite. Reason seeks truth and the good. Spirit gives us courage and righteous indignation, and appetite desires bodily pleasures and material gain. A virtuous person lives in a harmony whereas reason rules, spirit allies with reason, and appetite is kept in check. Analogous to a well-ordered city where philosopher guardians govern, soldiers enforce, and common citizens follow. This tripartite soul explains human conflicts and moral failures. Wrongdoings happens when the lower parts, spirit or appetite, overpower reason. Plato also believed in metempsychosis, the transmigration of souls. In the myth of Republic Book 10, he describes souls after death being judged and then choosing new lives to be born into, drinking from the river of forgetfulness before returning to the mortal realm. In Phaedrus, he imagines souls as celestial chariots that, if they cannot control their horses, fall from the heavens and are incarnated into human bodies, with philosophic souls having seen more of true reality before falling and thus retaining a dim recollection of it. This notion of recollection suggests that what we call learning is really the soul remembering truths it knew in a disembodied state, as demonstrated by Socrates guiding a slave boy to geometrical truths in Menno. The ethical upshot is that caring for one's soul is of paramount importance, a refrain throughout Plato's work echoing Socrates' teaching that virtue and the state of one's soul matter more than bodily interests. Plato's Socrates says that maintaining the soul's health throughout virtue and wisdom is our true purpose. This emphasis was a direct influence on later religious and philosophical traditions, which likewise prioritized the soul's salvation or enlightenment. There is a madness, which is a gift of the gods and the source of the greatest blessings. Plato's theory of knowledge is often summed up by the formula, knowledge is justified true belief. In various dialogues, he explores how we come to know anything with certainty. Knowledge for Plato must be of what truly is, the forms, as opposed to mere opinion, which deals with shifting phenomena. In the Republic, he draws a distinction. Knowledge is like seeing the clear daylight of reality, the forms, whereas opinion is like seeing shadows in twilight. It has some degree of truth, but not reliability. In Menno, he famously asks whether virtue can be taught and introduces the paradox of inquiry. One cannot search for what one doesn't know, since you wouldn't recognize it if found, nor for what one knows, since you already know it. His solution is the theory of anamnesis. The soul, having known the forms before birth, can recollect truths when prompted the right way. This Socratic questioning can elicit latent knowledge. The slave boy in Menno, with no formal training, is led to work out a geometric solution, suggesting the knowledge was in him implicitly. Plato argues that the soul had learned it in a prior existence. In Theaetetus, Plato examines definition of knowledge as perception, as true belief, as a true belief with an explanation, and finds problems with each. Notably, he refutes the relativism of the sophist Protagoras, man is the measure of all things, by arguing that if all the belief is true for the believer, it destroys the possibility of expertise or learning, since no one could ever be wrong. The dialogue leaves a puzzle. We never get a tidy answer to what knowledge is, illustrating Plato's willingness to embrace complexity. However, combining insights from different works, one can surmise that Plato's answer lies in his metaphysics. True knowledge is rational insight into the forms, achieved through dialectic, a rigorous method of reasoning and hypothesis testing, culminating in an intuitive grasp of the highest principles, like the good. He was skeptical of knowledge derived purely from sense experience, since the senses deceive and present mere appearances. Instead, reason and intellectual abstraction lead us to truth. This viewpoint, that knowledge is of universals and that the mind has access to a supra-empirical realm of truths, for example, mathematical truths or moral universals, is a hallmark of Platonic epistemology and has the lasting influence underpinning later rationalist philosophies. For Plato, ethics is grounded in the state of the soul and its alignment with the good. He, following Socrates, believed virtue is knowledge. No one knowingly does evil. People err out of ignorance of the truly good. However, Plato expands this view in the Republic. Knowing the good is necessary, but not sufficient. The appetites and emotions must be trained and in tune with reason. He presents the idea of the cardinal virtues: wisdom in the rational part, courage in the spirited part, temperance in the appetitive part obeying reason, and justice, the harmonious structure of the soul where each part does its proper role. An individual is just when the three parts of the soul are in the right order. And by analogy, a society is just when its three classes, rulers, guardians, producers, each do their appropriate work under wise guidance. This structural concept of justice, each part fulfilling its function, was a revolutionary ethical political theory. Plato's most detailed portrait of an ideal society happens in the Republic. In that utopia, philosopher kings who have true knowledge govern not for personal power, but for the benefit of all. The guardian class warriors support them, and the majority producing class provides for material needs. He infamously advocates communal family and property for the guardian class to avoid conflicts of interest, and the education of women alongside men for those roles, radical proposals in his time. Although Plato's Callipolis, beautiful city, is an aristocracy of merit and wisdom, he acknowledges it's an ideal seldom if ever realized. Republic also contains criticisms of degenerate forms of government in a quasi-historical cycle. His stance on democracy was ambivalent at best, shaped by the fate of Socrates. He saw unbridled democracy as leading to demagoguery and chaos. Indeed, in Republic, he likens a democratic city to a ship whose crew mutinies and refuses to heed the skilled navigator, preferring to drink and steer randomly, a pointed metaphor. Plato's distrust of rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech, as practiced by the sophists and politicians, is an ethical concern too. In Gorgias, Socrates critiques rhetoric as a false art that flatters the masses without imparting real knowledge, calling it a form of manipulation akin to cookery, pleasing but not truly beneficial. He advocates that the true rhetoric must be used only to convey truth and should be grounded in dialect and the speaker's knowledge of the subject, a theme returned to in Phaedrus. Plato also had a distinct stance on poetry and art in relation to ethics and truth. In Republic, Book 10, he banishes most poets from the ideal city, arguing that poets merely imitate appearances and pander to the emotions, thus corrupting the soul's rational harmony. He was wary of how Homer and tragic poets, beloved in Greek culture, portrayed the gods and heroes with vices, fearing this sets a poor moral example. Moreover, from his metaphysical perspective, art is an imitation of an imitation. A painting of a bed is a copy of the physical bed, which itself a copy of the form of the bed. Therefore, art is thrice removed from the truth. This severe view of art's deceptive power was one of Plato's most controversial positions. Yet in the dialogue Ion, Plato, though Socrates, softens by describing the poet as inspired by the muses, possessed a divine madness, not composing through knowledge but by inspiration, like a ring of magnets drawing creativity from a higher source. And in Symposium, he intriguingly describes the highest purposes of love as generating true virtue and giving birth and beauty, likening the philosopher to a poet of the soul. So Plato's relationship with poetry was complex. He was a poetic writer himself, whose myths and images stir the imagination even as he warns against delusion. His overreaching demand was that art and rhetoric should serve truth and moral improvement, not mere pleasure or persuasion. This principle would resonate through later aesthetics and literary criticism, prompting debates on the moral responsibility of art. Plato's Academy became known as a hub for mathematical research in addition to philosophy. He saw mathematics as the ideal training for the mind to grasp abstract truths. In the Republic, Books 6 through 7, Plato outlines an educational curriculum for future philosopher rulers that gives a central place to mathematical sciences, arithmetic, geometry, plain and solid, astronomy, and harmonics, music theory. These disciplines turn the mind away from the world of sense and toward the realm of permanent relations and proportions, thereby accustoming thinkers to consider forms. Plato himself contributed to conceptual discussions in mathematics. For example, he explored the notion of incommensurability, the idea that some lengths cannot be expressed as rational ratios, known from Pythagorean discoveries, and stressed the importance of geometrical knowledge. The 5 regular polyhedra carry his name as the Platonic solids because in Timaeus, he correlates each of the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, water with one of the regular solids, cube, octahedron, tetrahedron, icosahedron, respectively, and the dodecahedron he associated with the shape of the cosmos. This shows how deeply he imbued physical theory with mathematical structure. The Pythagorean influence on Plato was profound. Pythagoreans held that number and harmony underlie the structure of the cosmos. Plato echoed this in seeing mathematical order as evidence of a rational design in the universe. He was sometimes called the maker of mathematicians, as later mathematicians like Euclid and Archimedes were indirect heirs of mathematical culture. Notably, Theaetetus, a contemporary mathematician, is credited with early work on irrational numbers and likely the theory of five solids. His ideas probably fed into Plato's writings. While Plato did not invent mathematical theorems in the way Euclid did, his conceptual innovation was to insist that mathematical entities, like geometrical shapes and numbers, have a kind of reality that is more stable and knowable than the physical world. This can be seen as an extension of his theory of forms, with numbers and geometrical concepts themselves being forms or close to them. In the philosophy of mathematics, this view is known as mathematical Platonism, the belief that abstract mathematical objects exist independently of human minds. Indeed, even today, many mathematicians casually refer to themselves as Platonists if they believe numbers are discovered, not invented. Plato's legacy in mathematics is thus more philosophical. He framed the why of math's importance. It trains the mind for logical thought and uncovers the deep structure of reality. This reverence for mathematics influenced scientific thinkers for centuries. For example, Neo-Pythagorean and Neoplatonic scholars and later Renaissance scientists who took it almost as a religious truth that nature is written in the language of mathematics. Time was created together with the heavens, so that coming into being should be like the model of eternal being. We touched on this above, but to summarize Plato's views on rhetoric and poetry, he was one of the earliest thinkers to critique these arts from a philosophical, ethical standpoint. Rhetoric, as taught by sophists, was suspect to Plato because it often aimed at persuasion without regard for truth. In Gorgias, Socrates confronts a famous rhetorician, Gorgias, and argues that rhetoric is not a true technique, art or craft, concerned with justice, but a mere knack for flattery and winning over an ignorant crowd. He compares it to cooking. Just as a cook can make unhealthy food taste good, a rhetorician can make bad ideas seem persuasive. True justice, Socrates insists, is more important than the orator's success. He even claims it's better to suffer wrong than to do wrong, a direct rebuke to cynicism of sophistic rhetoric. Plato worries that skilled speakers who lack moral wisdom can manipulate public opinion and gain power, a phenomenon he likely saw in the Athenian assembly. This stance was undoubtedly shaped by the events of his youth. The execution of Socrates after a trial where rhetoric swayed the jury against reason and truth. However, Plato does not wholly reject the art of persuasion. In Phaedrus, he offers a more nuanced view. Rhetoric can be legitimate if the speaker truly knows the truth and adapts the presentation to the soul of the listener for their benefit. The Phaedrus likens a good speech to a living creature, with parts organically arranged. Structure matters, as does understanding psychological types of audiences. Plato effectively sketches the foundations of a philosophical rhetoric that is subordinate to dialect and truth. Only someone who has dialectically grasped the topic at hand and has a philosopher's care for the soul of the audience should practice rhetoric. In this sense, Plato paved the way for later discussion on the ethics of persuasion and the difference between sophistry and true philosophy. Regarding poetry, Plato had a love-hate relationship. He was a poetic writer himself, whose dialogues employ mythic storytelling. But he was wary of the emotional power of poetic performances in Greek culture. In Republic, he famously argues that most poetry, especially the dramatic poetry of Homer and the tragedians, should be excluded from the ideal state. His reasons: 1. Epistemological. Poets deal in imitations of appearances, not reality or truth. Thus, they have no knowledge of the things they depict. 2. Moral and psychological. Poetry excites passions and can glorify vice or weakness. For instance, tragic heroes lamenting loudly, which he thought cultivates a soft character in the audience. He wanted education to promote self-control and bravery, not the seemingly permissive morals often portrayed by gods and heroes in myth. However, Plato allowed that some poetry which praises the gods and promotes virtue could be permitted. He wouldn't throw out the hymns or honorable tales of heroes entirely. In Laws, he even outlines a state-regulated system of musical and poetic censorship to ensure the arts support moral ends. Paradoxically, Plato's critique of poetry had a hugely productive influence. It compelled later philosophers and poets to think hard about representation and the purpose of art. Aristotle's Poetics can be read as a reply, defending tragedy as philosophically meaningful. And later aesthetic theory often starts by grappling with Plato's assertions about art's deceptiveness versus its potential for truth. Where Socrates compares the rhapsode reciting Homer to a magnetized iron ring, transmitting inspiration from the muse to the poet to the performer or to the audience. The rhapsode speaks better than he knows, guided by divine inspiration, not intellect. Here, Plato is describing poetic madness as one of the divine madnesses, alongside love, prophecy, and mystic frenzy, that can actually lift the soul. So while he doesn't credit poets with knowledge, he does allow that they might be vehicles of a divine logos. In sum, Plato's own dialogues, blending logic and myth, reason and drama, show he was not anti-art per se. He simply demanded that art align with and be subordinate to philosophical truth. The insistence that ethics and truth should guide artistic expression was foundational in Western thought. In his final years, Plato continued to teach at the Academy and write. Aristotle studied under him until Plato's death, and later reports suggest the Academy at this time was an exciting place of debate in metaphysics, science, and philosophy. Plato lived to a ripe old age, around 80. Ancient biographical anecdotes of varying reliability describe a peaceful end. Another claims he died serenely in bed while a Thracian flute girl played music. By this time, the political landscape of Greece was shifting. Macedon under Philip II, father of Alexander the Great, was rising to dominance. Plato, however, had seen only the beginning of that change. He was buried on the grounds of the Academy, according to Diogenes, though no tomb has been discovered. Plato left no children and never married, as far as historical evidence suggests. His legacy was carried on by his nephew Speusippus, who became head of the Academy, and by countless intellectual heirs. Plato's writings were preserved by the Academy and later by manuscript copyists surviving the Hellenistic age, the Roman era, and into our own times, a remarkable chain of transmission that owed much to their revered status. Legend holds that Plato may have had an extensive unwritten doctrine he taught only in lectures, the so-called unwritten teachings concerning abstract principles like the one and the indefinite dyad. Of the 13 letters traditionally included in Plato's work, most are considered spurious by modern scholars, except the 7th letter, which many, though not all, believe to be authentic due to its deep reflection on Plato's philosophical career and the Syracuse affairs. In it, Plato even comments on why he never wrote a treatise on the good itself, famously stating that serious philosophical truth can't be just written down like other subjects, but requires a live dialectical encounter and is understood by only those who traveled the path of wisdom themselves. Within Plato's lifetime, his academy produced important philosophers in their own right. Speusippus explored epistemology and ethics. Xenocrates systematized metaphysics and considered the soul's nature, and others branched into fields like mathematics and rhetoric. The Platonic tradition was thus already branching out, even as rival schools like Aristotle's emerged. The attempt to sever everything from everything destroys discourse itself. Plato's influence on world intellectual history is staggering in scope. Alfred North Whitehead, the 20th century philosopher, once quipped, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." This famous remark, only slightly hyperbolic, captures how foundational Plato's ideas have been. Over the century, nearly every field of thought, philosophy, theology, science, political theory, education, engaged with Plato's concepts, whether in enthusiastic agreement or critical response. Plato's thought echoed through different eras and regions, especially focusing on the ancient Greek and Hellenistic world, religious thought, particularly in Christianity, the medieval period, including the Islamic world, the Renaissance, and even touches beyond the West. Plato's immediate impact was evident in his students and the schools that followed. The academy he founded continued for centuries, though it evolved in character. Initially under Speusippus and Xenocrates, the academy maintained and developed Plato's doctrines, with some shifts. Speusippus, for instance, downplayed the form of the good. By the 3rd century BCE, the academy had turned to skepticism, which, inspired partly by Socratic ignorance, taught that certain knowledge is unattainable and one must suspend judgment. Even in adopting skepticism, the academic philosophers saw themselves as loyal to Plato's spirit, perhaps emphasizing the aporetic side of dialogues like Theaetetus. Later in the 1st century BCE, Middle Platonism emerged as a revival of Plato's positive doctrines, synthesizing them somewhat with Pythagorean and Aristotelian ideas. Middle Platonists like Plutarch of Chaeronea and Philo of Alexandria interpreted Plato's demiurge as a monotheistic god and the forms as thoughts in the mind of God, paving the way for religious adaptations of Platonism. Simultaneously, Aristotle, Plato's most famous pupil, founded his own school and developed a system of thought often seen as opposed to Plato's, famously asking if there need to be forms of even trivial or negative things and raising the third man problem. He preferred to talk about substance and their properties in the concrete world, where Plato exalted the transcendent. Aristotle focused on the immanent. Yet for all their differences, Aristotle's philosophy is also in continuity with Plato's. Aristotle adopted Plato's concern for universals, ethics of virtue, and even borrowed much of Plato's conceptual vocabulary. Raphael's School of Athens fresco famously personifies this. It depicts Plato pointing upward to the realm of forms, and Aristotle gesturing outward, downward to the empirical world. Their dialogue symbolizes the balance of idealism and empiricism in Western thought. Other Hellenistic philosophies that came after Plato also owed him debts. The Stoics, 3rd century BCE, took inspiration from both Socrates and Plato in ethics. The Stoic idea of the rational soul living according to nature has parallels to Plato's idea of reason ruling the soul. The Stoics, however, rejected transcendent forms, instead developing a materialistic ontology. The Epicureans largely ignored Plato's metaphysics, focusing on atomism from Democritus, but they engaged with his ethics insofar as they strongly opposed the Platonic ideal of the good. Epicurus identified the good with pleasure, a view Plato would have disdained as base. Most significantly, in early centuries of the Roman Empire, Neoplatonism arose as a powerful philosophical movement that explicitly saw itself as the true heir of Plato. Founded by Plotinus, Neoplatonism built a systematic metaphysical cosmology with Plato's idea at its core. Plotinus taught of a single supreme reality, the one, or the good, from which emanated the intellect, realm of forms, and then the world soul, which in turn generates the material world, an elaborate interpretation of Plato's Timaean cosmology and form hierarchy. Plotinus sought to reconcile Plato with Aristotle and other thinkers, but Plato was his guiding light. He saw the goal of human life as mystical union with the One, an idea arguably present in Plato's Symposium and Republic, where the highest love or knowledge is a unity with the good. Plotinus' disciple Porphyry and later Proclus further extended Platonic metaphysics, commenting extensively on Plato's dialogues. By the 4th to 5th century CE, Neoplatonism had become the dominant philosophy in Greco-Roman world and even a kind of pagan theology. The last philosophers of Plato's Academy in Athens, until its closure in 529 CE, were Neoplatonists. This school preserved Plato's works and transmitted Platonic ideas into the Byzantine, Islamic, and Latin intellectual worlds. Because human affairs are never at rest, no fixed rule can apply to everything for all time. Plato's thoughts, especially as mediated by Neoplatonism, had a profound impact on the development of religious thought in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Many early theologians and philosophers in these traditions were educated in Greek philosophy and found Platonic concepts useful for articulating their religious doctrines. In Judaism, the Hellenistic Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, 1st century BCE, merged Platonism with biblical ideas, interpreting the Hebrew scriptures allegorically through a Platonic lens. He identified the forms with the ideas in the mind of the biblical God, Logos, and described the material world as an image of those divine ideas. This set a precedent for later Judeo-Christian thought that saw Platonic philosophy as not necessarily opposed to monotheistic religion, but as a preparation for it, an idea later echoed in Augustine for Christianity. Christianity was especially fertile ground for Platonism. Several early Christian thinkers were Platonists before conversion or saw harmony between Plato's philosophy and Christian revelation. St. Augustine of Hippo, the most influential of the Latin Church fathers, explicitly acknowledged Plato as the thinker who helped him understand the nature of God and the soul. Augustine wrote, "The utterance of Plato, the most pure and bright in all philosophy, scattering the clouds of error, has shone with such an effulgence as to illumine and enrich the most unhappy life of men." He regarded the Platonists as having grasped that truth and happiness that reside in the immaterial realm, and that God, the source of truth, must be the ultimate reality. Augustine's doctrine of God bears clear Platonic marks. God is eternal, the locus of unchanging truth, the source of all being, akin to the Platonic good. Augustine's understanding of the soul is superiority to the body, its need for divine illumination to know truth, its restless desire for God, is deeply Neoplatonic. For example, Augustine adopted the Platonic view that evil is not a substance but a privation of good, aligning with the idea that God, the good, did not create evil, and that all being is good insofar as it exists, a concept he got from Plotinus. The doctrine of illumination in Augustine's epistemology, that the human mind needs God's light to truly know anything, much as our eyes need the sun to see, is also a Christianized Platonic idea, echoing the allegory of the sun and the cave. Furthermore, Augustine's Trinitarian theology was arguably influenced by Plotinus' triadic ontology, one, intellect, and soul. He saw hints of the Trinity in Plato's writings via the Neoplatonists, and he used Platonic language to explain how the three divine persons could be consubstantial. In sum, Augustine created a Christian Platonism that became the bedrock of medieval Christian thought until the High Middle Ages. Other church fathers and Christian thinkers that were influenced by Plato, like Origen of Alexandria, was well versed in Platonism and incorporated the pre-existence of souls and other Platonic notions. The Cappadocian fathers like Gregory of Nyssa also drew on Platonic concepts of the soul's ascent and the immaterial nature of God. Pseudo-Dionysius, a mysterious Syrian Christian writer, adopted an overtly Neoplatonic framework to describe the hierarchy of angels and the mystical union with God. His divine names and mystical theology are essentially Christian Neoplatonism, introducing terms like ecstasy and union that influenced medieval mystics. In the Byzantine East, figures like Gregory Palamas and others still grappled with Platonic ideas, though Aristotle became more prominent in scholastic theology by the late medieval period. In the Islamic world, Plato was less directly influential than Aristotle, who was labeled the first teacher, but he was not unknown. Some of Plato's works were translated into Arabic. For example, an Arabic version of Republic circulated, with some creative additions, like the Republic of Animals used for political allegory. Islamic philosophers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna show Platonic influences through their incorporation of Neoplatonic elements. Al-Farabi wrote The Philosophy of Plato and The Philosophy of Aristotle, and he attempted to harmonize Plato and Aristotle. His metaphysics of emanation and his notion of the active intellect have roots in Neoplatonism, a lineage from Plotinus' ideas, which itself is rooted in Plato. Another Islamic philosopher, Al-Kindi, explicitly admired Plato. The Brethren of Purity, a 10th century mystical philosophical group, referenced Platonic ideas. Perhaps the clearest instance is Suawardi in 12th century, who founded the Illuminationist school and openly drew on Platonic and Zoroastrian imagery of light versus darkness and saw himself reviving the wisdom of the ancients, which included Plato. The Islamic mystical tradition Sufism sometimes used language that sounds Platonic, the soul's ascent, the illusionary nature of the world, though one must be cautious assuming influence versus parallel development. Nevertheless, through scholars in centers like Baghdad and Cordoba, Platonic thought, often filtered via the Enneads of Plotinus, which were translated into Arabic and mistakenly attributed to Aristotle as the theology of Aristotle, permeated medieval Islamic philosophy. The three great monotheistic religions each integrated Platonic ideas to such an extent that one historian noted, the three great monotheistic religions of the world owe much to Platonic thought, whether directly or through the works of his student and friend Aristotle. For Christianity in particular, Platonism became part of its DNA. During the medieval period, this Platonic Christian synthesis was eventually challenged by a resurgence of Aristotle, especially in the 13th century with Thomas Aquinas, but even Aquinas and scholastics remain indebted to certain Platonic assumptions, like the immaterial soul, objective universals, etc. And later, Renaissance Christian humanists and Neoplatonists like Marsilio Ficino explicitly sought to blend Plato with Christian theology anew. During the early Middle Ages in Western Europe, knowledge of Plato's works was fragmentary. Latin Christendom had only partial access to Plato's writings for a long time. The only dialogue widely available in Latin for centuries was Timaeus, thanks to a partial translation by Chalcidius in the 4th century. This meant that early medieval scholars often knew Plato secondhand, through Augustine or Boethius or encyclopedic summaries. Boethius wrote of Plato's views on universals and used Platonic reasoning in consolation of philosophy. The concept of universals was a huge debate in medieval scholasticism, essentially a revival of the Plato versus Aristotle argument. Realists like William of Champeaux took a Platonic line that universals are real, existing either in the mind of God or independently, whereas nominalists or conceptualists leaned Aristotelian in saying only individuals exist and universals are just names or mental concepts. This is often called the problem of universals, and its persistence shows Plato's ghost in medieval thought. In the Byzantine Empire, where Greek literacy remained high, the full corpus of Plato was preserved and studied. Byzantine scholars like Michael Pacellus from 11th century and Gemistus Plethon from 15th century were ardent Platonists. Plethon, in fact, so idolized Plato that he proposed replacing Christianity with a kind of revived pagan Platonic pantheism. In 1439, Plethon traveled to Florence for Council of Ferrara Florence and attempted to unite Eastern and Western churches. There he lectured on Plato versus Aristotle, inspiring the Medicis and Italian scholars with the vision of Plato's wisdom. This directly catalyzed the Renaissance revival of Plato. More on that shortly. Meanwhile, by the 12th century in Western Europe, more Plato was becoming available. Henry Aristippus translated Phaedo and Meno into Latin in the 12th century. In the 13th century, William of Moerbeke translated the complete works of Plato, as well as Greek commentaries, into Latin at the urging of Aquinas' circle. These translations, however, came right when Aristotle's works were flooding in and dominating the universities. Hence, medieval scholasticism from the 13th to 15th century was more Aristotelian. St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, built on Aristotle, although he still calls Plato the philosopher at times and uses Platonic idea versus Augustine. One should note the curious case of Chalcidius' Platonic cosmogony. The Timaeus, with its account of creation by a benevolent demiurge and the world soul and so on, was hugely influential on medieval cosmology and Christian theology of creation. Because Timaeus was interpreted allegorically to fit Genesis, it gave medieval thinkers a framework to discuss matter, the four elements, the harmony of the cosmos, and so on, often more so than Aristotle's physics until later. The idea of a rational order and nature placed there by a divine creator matched well with Christian doctrine, a point of contact between Plato and Christianity. In summary, during the Middle Ages, Plato's direct influence in the Latin West was somewhat eclipsed by Aristotle, but indirectly through Augustine and others, he was always present. In the Greek East and the Islamic world, Plato, via Neoplatonism, remained a central pillar of philosophical spirituality. The Renaissance, between 14th and 16th century, witnessed a dramatic Platonic revival, often called the Platonic Renaissance. Scholars in Italy, fueled by the influx of Greek manuscripts, thanks to Byzantine refugees and renewed study of Greek, rediscovered Plato as a fresh alternative to the dry scholastic Aristotelianism of the medieval universities. In 1462, the Florentine ruler Cosimo de' Medici founded a new Platonic academy in Florence, entrusting Marsilio Ficino to lead it. Ficino learned Greek and translated Plato's complete works into Latin, published in 1484, the first complete rendering available in the West. He also translated Plotinus and wrote his own Platonic theology. Ficino and his circle, which included Pico della Mirandola and influenced artists like Botticelli and Michelangelo, sought to harmonize Christianity with Platonism, much like Augustine had, but with more magical and mystical flavor. Ficino believed Plato was part of a divine philosophia perennis, eternal philosophy, revealed by God to ancient sages. Under his influence, Platonic love became a fashionable concept in literature, an idealized, non-carnal love that leads one to the divine, derived from the Symposium. Renaissance art was also touched by Platonic ideas of ideal beauty. For example, Botticelli's Primavera and Birth of Venus can be interpreted through Ficino's lens as depicting the Platonic idea of heavenly beauty. In England, the influence of Renaissance Platonism gave rise to the Cambridge Platonists in the 17th century, a group of theologian philosophers like Ralph Cudworth, Henry Moore, John Smith, at Cambridge University drew on Plato and Plotinus to advocate a rational spiritual Christianity against both the dogmatic Calvinism and mechanical materialism of their day. They emphasized reason and the existence of innate ideas, echoing Platonic forms of timeless truth, and moral knowledge written in the soul, clear Platonic echoes. Even earlier, in Elizabethan England, Platonism influenced literature. Sir Philip Sidney's defense of poesy references the idea that a poet gives us a golden word better than brazen nature, reminiscent of Plato's ideal forms surpassing ordinary reality, though Sidney actually defends poetry against Plato's charges, an interesting twist. The poet Edmund Spenser was inspired by Platonic concepts of beauty and love. In the 17th century, poets like John Milton infused their Christian humanism with Platonic imagery. Milton's Eve in Paradise Lost is sometimes seen through the prism of Renaissance Neoplatonism and her relationship of physical to spiritual beauty. Beyond England, Platonism in Europe influenced scientists and mathematicians who saw a deep connection between mathematics, nature, and divinity, inheriting Plato's faith in an intelligible cosmic order. Johannes Kepler, for example, was enamored with the Platonic solids and initially thought they determined the spacing of planetary orbits. Galileo and Descartes were also arguably influenced by Platonic ideas. Galileo by conviction that nature's book is written in mathematical language, a very Platonic attitude, and Descartes by innate ideas, doctrine, and pursuit of certainty beyond sense. Though Descartes was also critical of pure forms, his method had a Platonic rationalist spirit. The Platonic tradition continued to flourish in philosophy sporadically. In the 18th to 19th centuries, the German philosopher Schelling and others in German idealism revisited Platonic ideals. In the 20th century, mathematician philosophers like Alfred North Whitehead and Kurt Gödel openly identified as Platonists in believing in objective, abstract realities. Whitehead's witticism about philosophy being footnotes to Plato underscores how Plato's questions and ideas remain central. Even modern analytic philosophy grapples with Plato in debates on universals, realism versus nominalism, the nature of justice, and so on, while political philosophy frequently returns to republic and laws for foundational ideas about utopias, censorship, education, and the role of philosophers in society. One intriguing question is the possible influence of Platonism beyond the Western world, for instance in India. Historically, there is no clear evidence of Plato's direct influence on classical Indian philosophy. Plato lived and died before any significant contact between Greek and Indian thought. However, after Alexander the Great's incursions, which occurred a few decades after Plato's death, there were exchanges between Hellenistic and Indian cultures, like in the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, and through travelers like Pyrrho, the founder of skepticism, who accompanied Alexander to India and was influenced by Indian gymnosophists. These contacts largely post-date Plato, so any convergence of ideas is likely coincidental or indirect. That said, modern scholars have sometimes pointed out parallels between Platonic and Indian philosophies. For example, the Katha Upanishad's analogy of the soul as the master of a chariot with senses as horses is reminiscent of Plato's Phaedrus chariot allegory. Both Plato and Indian traditions like Vedanta talk about a higher reality beyond appearances and the importance of turning inward to find truth. Some have even compared Plato's cave with Maya, illusion, in Indian thought, or the ascent to the good with the enlightenment of moksha. These are intriguing analogies, but likely independent developments from confronting similar existential questions. By the time of British India, 19th to 20th centuries, Plato certainly became known to Indian intellectuals via Western education. Influential figures such as Sri Aurobindo or Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan engaged with Greek philosophy, including Plato, sometimes finding resonance with their own Vedantic ideas of absolute reality and the soul's immortality. So while one cannot say Plato influenced ancient India, in the modern era his ideas have been part of the global philosophical discourse that India also participated in. Interestingly, one might consider the Neoplatonic influence that traveled with Islam to India. For instance, Dara Shikoh, 17th century prince, translated the Upanishads and was interested in finding common ground between Sufism, which had Neoplatonic flavors, with Hindu Vedanta. While Plato wasn't directly in that picture, the general Platonic worldview of a hierarchy of reality and the soul's ascent was a shared undercurrent. In terms of inventions or tangible influences, Plato did not invent a physical device or machine, but he arguably invented or at least significantly advanced several things in the realm of ideas. The notion of philosophy as a comprehensive subject, One could say he invented the discipline of philosophy as we know it, with systematic inquiry into ethics, epistemology, metaphysics, and so on, armed with a distinctive critical method. Then we have the literary genre of philosophical dialogue. While others like his contemporaries wrote Socratic dialogues too, Plato's mystery of it set the model for using dialogue as a means of philosophical argument and teaching. We have the academy, often hailed as the first enduring institution of higher learning, a prototype of the university. This was an institutional invention, creating a place where thinkers could pursue knowledge collaboratively over generations. In mathematics, as mentioned, while not an inventor of specific theorems, he inspired the study of abstract geometry and the idea of mathematical proof-oriented thinking. The Platonic solids were known earlier, but Plato popularized them and gave them cosmic significance to the extent that they bear his name in mathematics and geometry. Conceptually, one could say Plato invented the idea of a utopia in Western literature. Republic is the earliest detailed utopian proposal for an ideal state. This inspired later utopian works, such as Thomas More's Utopia in the 16th century. And some attribute to Plato the invention of the Atlantis myth, a full-fledged fictional society used allegorically. This story went on to have its own huge cultural footprint, from Renaissance speculation to modern fiction and pseudo-archaeology. Plato's influence is so vast that it permeates the very language and framework of Western thought. Terms like Platonic ideal, Platonic love, and Platonic solid are common parlance. Philosophically, Platonism became one of the perennial perspectives, emphasizing reality's spiritual or abstract dimension. In every era, Platonists have advocated for eternal truths and the priority of ideals, while opponents, Aristotelians, materialists, empirists, have sharpened their own positions by refuting Plato's claims. Thus, even adversaries keep Plato's questions in play. In religion, Platonic philosophy provided concepts to articulate doctrines of God, creation, and the soul, with Augustine's Christian Platonism being a prime example. In science and math, a Platonic faith that the universe is intelligible and that our ideas correspond to cosmic order underlies the scientific mindset. Einstein once remarked that the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible, a very Platonic sentiment. In modern philosophy, debates about the existence of universals, the nature of numbers, or the objectivity of moral values often recapitulate a Platonic versus anti-Platonic dynamic. For example, analytic philosophers discuss Platonic realism in mathematics. Do numbers exist independently? And in metaphysics, do properties like redness exist apart from red things? Many moral philosophers still entertain a form of moral realism that can be traced to Plato's idea that justice or goodness have real being beyond social convention. From antiquity to present, few have been celebrated as Plato for intellectual daring and breadth. In Raphael's School of Athens, Plato is depicted at the center, pointing upward to the heavens of forms, symbolizing philosophy's aspiration to transcend the mundane. This image aptly captures his legacy. Across ages, those who sought a reality behind appearances, a unity behind diversity, or a hope behind the temporal have often turned to Plato for inspiration. As the great thinker's biography puts it, our very conception of philosophy owes a great depth to his work. No area of inquiry seems foreign to him. In conclusion, Plato's life story, from aristocratic youth in war-torn Athens, to devoted follower of Socrates, to traveler seeking wisdom in foreign lands, to founder of the academy, to philosopher entwined with Sicilian tyrants, itself is a rich narrative of a seeker of truth in a turbulent world. His writings not only give us a window into that classical world with its agora discussions, sophists, and courts, but also speak to timeless human concerns. What is justice? What is the good life? What can we know? What should we teach our children? Is the soul immortal? And what is the ultimate reality? Plato's bold answers, forms, the good, recollection, philosopher kings, and the immortal soul continue to provoke and inspire. Over 2,300 years after his death, engaging with Plato is still a rite of passage for any serious student of philosophy. Indeed, one might say that as long as humans continue to ask big questions, Plato's voice will resound, challenging us to ascend from the cave of ignorance into the light of knowledge and reason. Across the next 2 millennia, Plato's voice echoed far beyond Attica. The Hellenistic successors preserved his texts. Plotinus forged them into towering metaphysics of Neoplatonism. Augustine baptized them for Latin Christendom, Arabic translators smuggled them into Islamic philosophy, and Renaissance humanists, newly flush with Greek manuscripts, rekindled their power in art, science, and political theory. Wherever minds have sought a reality deeper than appearance, whether in Christian contemplation, Sufi illumination, or the mathematical harmonies of Kepler's heavens, Plato has stood close by, pointing upward. Yet his influence has not been that of an oracle handing down settled answers. In dialogue after dialogue, he refuses to close the question, leaving his readers in productive bewilderment. The Republic sketches an ideal state, only for the laws to concede the messianic compromises of actual politics. The luminous theory of forms is paraded in one work and dissected in the next. By dramatizing philosophy as an unfinished conversational enterprise, Plato bequeathed to posterity not a creed but a method, a disciplined wonder that demands reason for every claim, even its own. That bequest remains urgent. When modern mathematicians debate whether numbers exist independently of minds, they rehearse an argument Plato began. When citizens worry that rhetoric is eclipsing truth, they repeat anxiety Socrates voiced in the Agora. And when any of us suspect that the visible world is but a dim reflection of deeper patterns, we glimpse the cave wall and the distant sun of the good. Plato's Athens is long vanished, but the questions he raised about knowledge, justice, love, and reality still structure the landscape of human thought. To read him is to feel that architecture, at once austere and exhilarating, take shape in one's mind, and to answer him, even in dissent, is to join the very conversation that makes philosophy possible. Hope you all enjoyed, and until the next one.